Hello, and welcome to Leaderfolk, an inclusive look inside the Jewish community. I'm your host, Sara. I'm so thrilled to welcome our guest today, Karen Erlichman. Karen is currently a therapist and spiritual director in private practice in the San Francisco Bay Area and brings with her 30 years of experience as a Jewish communal professional. In addition to that work, she continues to mentor and coach within the Jewish community and is a fellow with the Jewish Studio Project. So, Karen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
So I love to start by just asking, what is your relationship to Judaism? And alongside that, what is the path that brought you to where you are today? Kind of a big question.
That is a big question. I grew up on the East Coast. I'm from Philadelphia originally, and I was raised in a very secular, assimilated Jewish household. And I promise I'm not going to give you my entire Jewish life story, but I really had a deep spiritual love affair with Judaism from the age of 5, somewhat to the horror of my parents. And would have pursued the rabbinic path, but at that time there were no women rabbis. And so I became a social worker and a spiritual director and a therapist. And somewhere along the way, actually, when I finished graduate school in social work, I didn't know anything about Jewish communal professional work. I really didn't. I had a bat mitzvah and knew about the synagogue I grew up in, but I didn't know anything about the organized Jewish community. And I'm sort of making little air quotes as I say that. And I was networking for a job as a social worker. And some of my informational interviews ended up being with folks who work in the Jewish community. And I got a job, my first job out of social work school. And I was 24 years old, was working in the planning department at the Federation in Philadelphia. So that was kind of my first exposure. When I say I didn't know anything, I knew nothing. I had never heard of, I knew there were JCCs and some kids went to Jewish camp, but I really had no idea. And that job turned out not to be a good fit for me for a variety of reasons, but definitely shaped my sense of myself as a Jew and also as a Jewish feminist and as a queer Jew. It was not a really comfortable or easy place to be. It was not a comfortable or easy place to be a feminist or progressive or an LGBTQ person. And so after 14 months, I was like, I got to go. But some seeds were planted in me from that experience. And I actually still have a close friend from that time when we both worked at Federation, and she doesn't work there anymore either. But I always felt some sense of this community these are my people and this is important to me, and was really delighted to discover what was at the time a growing, or what was new to me, I guess it was still growing, feminist and LGBTQ progressive Jewish community. And then I moved to the Bay Area shortly after that and was always doing some freelance leading groups and workshops and retreats and things like that. And then had some various part-time positions in the Jewish community. I worked for Jewish Family and Children's Services, running an interfaith program. And then for about 3.5 years, I was the regional director for Jewish Mosaic, which then was absorbed into Keshet. So Jewish Mosaic was an organization that did LGBTQ advocacy, research, and inclusion within the Jewish community, and then eventually merged with Keshet.
So that is really wonderful, and I'm curious to hear more about how your background as a social worker maybe set the stage for the Jewish communal work that you were able to do. Especially, I would be curious to hear about in relation to Jewish Mosaic. I imagine that you were particularly qualified to be an advocate and to create spaces that were safe and comfortable and productive for the individuals that you were working with there, maybe in contrast even to your experience with the job at the Federation.
Yeah, it was definitely in contrast to my job at the Federation. Although my my boss at the Federation was a social worker, and so because I worked in the planning department, it was social work in a way. It was community planning, and so there I learned a lot in that job, and some of it was quite painful, but I did learn about what does it mean to convene communal conversations about the planning and allocation and distribution of resources, even if I didn't always agree with how that was done. And I also learned like how to take really good notes in a meeting, so, which is a skill that has served me well, so that somebody can go back and read those notes like 10 years later and really have a felt sense of what the process was in the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a time when there was a lot of like to learn about the history of Jewish communal service, and there was like a network of support, and there was mentoring, and there were classes and like summer institutes, and it was a time and a location, I don't know how it was in the rest of the country, where developing and mentoring young Jewish communal professionals was happening. And at the same time, there were some things that were problematic about that. So, like, for example, I remember going to my first, I'm not even going to like talk about the campaign stuff because that's just way too loaded. But I remember being at some like organization wide luncheon, and after the meal came, all of a sudden everybody started banging on the tables, and they're like singing some song in Hebrew that I didn't know, but I was at work. I didn't want to look like an idiot, so I was banging on the table too. And I remember afterward, like taking a friend of mine aside and saying, like, I'm really embarrassed. I didn't know what that was. What was that prayer? Why do we do it? And what about the other people there who might not know, but who are too embarrassed to ask, or the people who work for Federation who aren't Jewish, who might really not know this prayer, who were in the room? Like, I was really asking some of those hard questions. And so that particular quality of like insider outsider status, like how do you make people feel welcome, or what happens when people feel alienated, and what are the things that you do that make people feel either alienated or welcome, like really has shaped my work in my life and my work in every way. And I remember when I was running the interfaith program, and I would say to my boss, like, this is not just because this is the right thing to do as a Jew. Like, this is my life, right? This is how I live my life in an interfaith and a multicultural, welcoming community, and relationship. And so when I started working for Jewish Mosaic, a lot of the organizations, especially in the Bay Area, which prides itself on being very liberal and progressive, those organizations all were really supportive. Like, this is so great that Jewish Mosaic exists. And of course, we welcome LGBTQ people into our school, our JCC, our congregation, but we don't really have the time or resources to allocate money or personnel for it. Like, we just have like a message on our website that says, we welcome everybody. I'm kind of oversimplifying, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
And so it was really the beginning of raising questions about what do we mean when we say now what we refer to as diversity, equity, and inclusion, which often, has to do with racial equity, which is also super important. And it's one thing to give lip service to, yes, we really care about these things. And yes, the tradition teaches us that these things are important. But what does that look like on the ground, in action, in real time, in everyday life?
So what were some of the things that you did to kind of help move the needle in these environments?
So we had monthly networking meetings. Like, I created basically like a support network of LGBTQ Jewish professionals and allies who care deeply about this issue, many of whom felt like they couldn't speak about it publicly in their organizations, or if they did, they were told that yes, that's important, but it's not a priority. So I created a space for people to support each other and to talk about best practices. And we met once a month. And then I also was available for one-on-one mentoring and coaching, talking with people about that. I met with different organizations. We talked about doing like institutional audits. We did a Bay Area assessment, a population study about LGBTQ Jews in the Bay Area. And a report came out with that data that was supposed to, and presumably did, shape the allocation of resources. I also worked on a project called the Institute for Welcoming Resources or something like that. It was in partnership with Hebrew Union College Institute for, this very unfortunate title, Institute for Judaism and Sexual Orientation, with my colleague and friend Joel Kushner. And that was a text-based approach, a text-based curriculum to work with congregations to create more welcoming communities for LGBTQ Jews. And I remember I worked with actually a very progressive congregation in the Bay Area. And I remember them saying, wow, we realize it's not that we're not welcoming to LGBTQ people. We're not actually welcoming to anybody, which is not to say that we don't want to really be a big open tent, but it means that like our human behavior is we're insular, we're cliquish, we do things the way we've always done them. We don't step out of our comfort zones to make connections with people. We're not visibly demonstrating what we actually care about. And there's this gap between the values we say we care about and what our behavior actually looks like.
I have a fear that that is way more common than any of us in the Jewish communal profession would like to admit.
Yeah, I think that's true.
When you first got in touch with me a while back, one of the things that you wrote to me about was this idea of finding yourself on the margins and what to do when you find yourself there. And you said, build an altar and throw a ritual party.
Yes, I
And
did.
my interest is extremely piqued, and I would love for you to explain, what does that mean? It sounds fun.
Yeah, I think for most of my life in relationship to the organized Jewish community, I felt like I was like a little kid pressing my nose against the glass of the window pane, like, how come they won't let me in? Like, there was some way that like, here's this room, right? Here's the room where or the cool kids are, or like the power room, or the table where the big decisions get made. Where the straight white men are making all the decisions, basically, to oversimplify a little bit. And how do I get to that table? And every time I would come closer to that in some form, the door would get slammed in my face. And eventually I thought, how do I understand that spiritually? And what would happen? God is on the margins also. And the people who are, quote, marginalized people, like, those are my people. And there is something that powerful that can happen when we are together, rather than, we keep saying, like, it's not an either or, right? Both are important, but there's so much powerful transformative work that can happen on the margins. And that is where I keep feeling called over and over and over. And so what I mean when I say I want to throw a ritual party is it's really important to me that people who, whether they're born Jewish or are curious about Judaism or convert to Judaism or are Jewish adjacent, as the saying goes, that they can feel welcomed and feel included. We can feel welcomed and included, and that our wholeness is reflected back to us, and that we have access to tradition and ritual and sacred texts. And you see some of this happening, or I see some of this happening, like with the work that B'nai Lappi is doing with Sara, for example. Like, the Talmud is for everybody. It's not just for the people who look like the people who wrote it. It's for all of us. And how do we both reclaim the traditional rituals and make them new and meaningful, and also create our own rituals? How do we create rituals for top surgery, for name changes, for different ages and stages of life, for grieving, all of those things? And how do we do that with a sense of empowered joy and celebration?
I think it was in our first episode with Aliza Klein where she talks about the malleability of Jewish ritual and how there is so much freedom in there. And so is that part of your work as a spiritual director, that you help people kind of create rituals around some of these life changes that aren't traditionally prescribed by the Jewish community?
Definitely. So I've been really lucky and blessed to have people in my life who have joined me in that quest. Like, I often say it's miraculous I'm still Jewish based on my experience of being a Jewish communal professional. And so I do often have people who are seeking that juicy, life-affirming spirituality and want ritual, but feel like that story I told you about the Birkat Hamazon, like they don't want to be that person who feels embarrassed or ashamed because they don't know, they don't want to ask the dumb question. Or they also feel like they've been disappointed or disillusioned or hurt by the institutions. Like, I don't, they want to belong to a synagogue, but they're afraid to, or they don't know how, or they don't know how to find one, or they went and they had a bad experience, or that is not unique to Judaism, by the way. So, and also to empower people not only to create their own rituals, and in sessions, I often will do ritual with people, but also to say, like, these texts are for all of us, right? Like, all the sacred Jewish texts, like, those are for all of us. It doesn't matter whether you're ordained or you're a layperson, whether you can read Hebrew or not, whether you went to Hebrew school or not, if you went to, whether or not, there's so much of that. Like, I had an old friend who used to call it Jewish sparring. There's so much of, like, let me show you my Jewish credentials, and like a competitiveness around how we are Jewish that's actually really hurtful and harmful and not welcoming at all. And that happens even sometimes in the queer Jewish community. And it's really not okay with me.
Yeah, I definitely see aspects throughout our history within the Jewish community of kind of gatekeeping certain rituals or gatekeeping against certain communities in a really harmful way. So I appreciate you sharing about this work, because I find it very inspiring, whether it's with LGBTQ individuals, whether it's being more inclusive of Black Jews or other Jews of color. I think that there's still a lot of work to be done to make sure that Judaism feels personal to anybody who wants to find connection through it.
Definitely. One of the most humbling experiences I had when I worked for Jewish Mosaic was there was a young woman who was a Jeremiah Fellow through what's now called Bend the Arc, I think what used to be called Progressive Jewish Alliance. And they had to do some kind of final project as a Jeremiah Fellow, and she wanted to have a grief group for young Jewish adults who had experienced a loss, because she found that the traditional grief support groups that were offered by Jewish social service agencies or even at the synagogues really weren't serving that demographic. And so she convened a bunch of us together, and, those of us who are licensed mental health professionals or certified chaplains, were really nervous about, well, grief is a serious thing, and you have to be careful. You might get people who are depressed or suicidal, who are very, we got kind of anxious, and some of those concerns are valid concerns, but a colleague of mine basically called me out and said, Karen, you are being a credential snob. This is not a substitute for actual psychotherapy. What we want to do, and what this woman is asking for, is to build community for young Jews who have experienced loss. And I really sat with that and had to look at that part of myself and to see how I had internalized some of that gatekeeper mentality, and really shifted my position to say there's a difference between building community and doing a grief psychotherapy group. And that group happened and was quite successful. And since then, through partnering with some other organizations like the Dinner Party and other organizations that work with 20s and 30s young adults around loss, building community around loss for young Jews is actually happening. And it has nothing to do with credentials.
Right. Thank you for sharing that story. I love when we're able to kind of look back on our own experiences and say, this is something that I had to learn.
Yep.
So I appreciate you coming forward with that. I would love also to hear, to circle back to this work that you're doing as a fellow with the Jewish Studio Project.
Great.
What can you tell us about that?
The Jewish Studio Project started, I'm going to guess and say about 5 years ago, by a retired art therapist and her daughter, who's a rabbi, Adina Allen, and her husband, to take concepts and practices from art therapy and modify them to use them as a vehicle to teach people about Judaism and Jewish spirituality. And they have a studio in Berkeley, and we're recording this during pandemic and shelter in place. So nothing is happening actually in person right now. But for the past few years, they've had 5-day immersives where people come to Berkeley and are in the studio for 5 days. They have a very particular methodology. It's not just it's very different. How can I describe this? I should be able to describe this well since I'm a fellow. They are using creativity and creative expression as a way to relate to Judaism through your right brain and in community together. So there's a piece that's about studying sacred texts, but it's not like studying from the neck up. It's really about an engagement with the text and then using creative process as a way to deepen your connection to the text. It's not like what I grew up with in my Jewish education as a child was, here's the text and this is what the rabbis say and that's what the text means. And even if we discuss it, these are the parameters in which it is acceptable to interpret the text. They're offering something completely different. And so they decided to seek some funding, which they then got to develop a pool of people with whom they've trained us in their methodology. And now each of us is taking what we're learning and bringing it out into our work in the world. Some of us work independently, like me, as a freelance person. Some people work in Jewish organizations. Some people are clergy, some are Jewish educators, and we have this amazing learning cohort together where we are practicing the methodology, we're learning with the founders of the organization. And for me, like when I went to that 5-day immersive before I became a fellow, I came home and I said to my wife, I have hope for the future of my people. Like it was so profoundly different from anything else I had experienced. And it was like, and you don't have to be an artist. It's not about making good art. It's about using that part of yourself. It's about taking risks and without any judgment, no critique, and allowing that essence of who you are as a Jew or as a person who's curious about Judaism to engage with the text and then express itself creatively.
Can you give an example of something that you've worked through, or a piece of text that has kind of become illuminated by this work?
Sure. The immersive that I went to as a student or as a participant, my first exposure to what they do was in the fall of 2018. And the entire 5-day immersive was focused on Lech Lecha. Like that's where we were that was the Torah portion that week. And so we spent time engaged with that text and we would read a piece of it and then go into creative process around it and then have some time to share it in the group. Like, what does that mean? You know, what's the meaning that text has for me? How do I experience myself as called out into the wilderness? What do I need to leave behind? What is it going to mean for me to create a legacy for my life and the future generations? How am I encountering God in that moment? And then to express that rather than like writing an article or a sermon or something academic, it's that I'm expressing something creatively. And then how do I get to then engage with that sacred text in a different way? I wish you could see me so I could like pull out. I still have the artwork so I could show you. I got it. I framed it.
Oh, that's so awesome. I think that's so cool. Very inspiring, and I wish that there were more opportunities to approach text and Jewish philosophy like that. I think it sounds very energizing.
It's really energizing. And it's also, it's not, for me, it's not just like, this is like a cool new technique. Like it really is, it's a profound paradigm shift. It really is like, you don't have to be a great artist any more than you have to be a great rabbinic scholar. It really is, let's see what kind of transformation and connection and vision for the future of our community is possible by this new way of engagement.
And now, as a fellow, having gone through the immersive and working to qualify yourself kind of in this field, is the work that you go on to do individual, or do you then get to lead other groups, or how does that work?
Well, it's funny you should ask, because one of the things we have to do, we're now in phase 2 in the second year of the fellowship training, is we have a project we have to do. And so I have a couple things that are percolating for me as possibilities. One is bringing the Jewish Studio Project methodology to spiritual direction. And what that might be with Jewish spiritual directors. The person I'm working on it with is my same friend that I did the Welcoming Congregations project with. So we've stayed connected through this whole time, and he's a JSP fellow also. And then another possibility is, how might this work be used in social justice organizing? How might this work be part of what Tikkun Olam activism looks like? How is this a way of building community together, of creating dialogue together? How do we get outside of our old, well-practiced ways of being and take risks in new ways? And, what's happening in our world right now is really like calling and yearning for new ways of being and doing.
Yes, it is. I think I just have one more question for you, Karen.
Okay.
And I think that it kind of weaves together your Jewish communal work as well as your experience as a therapist and spiritual director. And hearing you talk about your time at the Federation, having that not be a really like healthy or comfortable environment for you, I think is something that a lot of Jewish communal professionals can relate to, either because it's an actively harmful environment. And I don't mean to like paint with broad strokes about the Jewish community. It is a wonderful place. But I think that whether it is that kind of environment that you encountered, or just the stressors that come from being a Jewish communal professional and the blurring of the lines between the personal and the professional life, that burnout is a consideration for Jewish communal professionals. And it's hard to come to work in such a personally resonant space and maintain boundaries.
Yeah.
And I would love if you could just, I don't know if you have any advice or if this resonates with you, but I want to hear your thoughts.
Such a good question. So a couple thoughts come to mind. The first thing is, find a mentor who is really invested in your growth and your development and your success. And that may not be within the organization where you are currently employed. It may be somebody outside. Like, ironically, even in that job at the Federation, there were a couple of lay leaders, actually. The committees that I served all happened to have chair people that were women, which was shocking at the time. Actually, I have to say it was completely shocking. And they taught me, they advised me, they coached me, they advocated for me. They were invested in my learning. And I don't know how. It doesn't mean I agreed with them on everything, but there was some way in which I had their support and their time and their commitment. So I do that formally and informally mentor a lot of people, because it can be so lonely and isolating to be what you're just describing, where, the expectations that are on Jewish communal professionals about your time, your energy, your priorities. There's a lot of rhetoric and lip service that's given to like these core Jewish values, but then what you actually see on the ground is in direct contradiction with those Jewish values. So sometimes you need a place to just have a conversation with somebody to say, is it just me? Or is there a gap here between the values, that value statement that's hanging in the lobby of the building versus how I'm being treated by my boss or the executive director? So that's one thing. I think having peer support is huge. I would love to see more peer support networks for Jewish communal professionals. I also think asking those questions up front, like what's expected of me in terms of hours of time spent or availability, so that the expectations are really, really clear. What opportunities for advancement are there? I mean, it's your question is a large question. I'm trying to see if I can get a little more specific. I don't think there are a lot of places, I can't think of any, where Jewish communal professionals are having intentional conversations about burnout. Everybody sort of talks about it and jokes about it, like just for clergy alone, like what is expected of clergy. Like, I don't know how clergy have time to have a life or children, or there need to be some conversations about like what is realistic so that our clergy are not burning out or getting sick or leaving and going and doing something else and having to abandon their calling.
Right. Thank you. That was a very thoughtful answer. Karen, thank you so much for joining us today on Leaderfolk. I'm so grateful for your time, for your thoughtfulness, for joining us remotely from all the way across the country, from the Bay Area to our producer, Lonnie Goldsmith, who almost never gets a shout out on here. So thank you, Lonnie.
Thank you, Lonnie.
In Minneapolis, and myself here in Cleveland. So thank you, Karen.
Thank you so much. It's been really wonderful to have this conversation with you.
Leaderfolk is all about elevating voices and starting conversations. So now we'd love to hear from you. Email us at podcast@tcjewfolk.com to share your thoughts, your ideas, or to nominate future guests. Leaderfolk is a project of Jewfolk Inc. and the Jewfolk Podcast Network. For more information, visit tcjewfolk.com/podcast.